My name's David Olson. I'm a producer with The Right Stuff International and Nozomi Entertainment. And I'm just here to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do back in the production department. I think a lot of people don't really know what production does, especially like in North American production, like what types of work we do. There are a lot of people who do, but there's a lot of questions and things like that too. And one of the things in particular that we do a lot of is just taking the old materials and the things that are delivered to us from the Japanese and trying to assemble them in a way that is meaningful. It's in a way that, you know, makes sense for the disc, getting the stuff that is useful to us, and anything that we have permission to use, or the things that we might need to work on or repurpose, or try and find a way to make it work in a modern release. Because some of these materials come in and they're very, very old. They're degraded in some ways. There's a lot of things that go into putting the discs together from start to finish. And so my goal is to kind of go over some of those things, maybe in not like a super formal way, but in a way that, you know, kind of showcases some of like the cool little things that we see and run into as we're doing this type of work. Typically, when we get a show, one of the first things that we want to do is we want to create a reference file, a reference video file that we can use for either getting something translated, or if there's a translation that already exists, getting the show subtitled and getting all the subtitles arranged and lined up. And when we make the reference files, usually it's the Japanese track in stereo and from start to finish, and then there's a burn-in time code on the screen that basically showcases at what point in the video you are in, whether you're 1 hour in or 30 minutes in, and what the exact time and frame number is and everything. And that's good for the translators, and it's good for us when we're doing subtitling. But with El Hazard, I had done all the work to lay out all these files and do the subtitling. I completed the series, and then as I'm going back through the video files, I found something was kind of interesting. It's that the show's 5.1 is actually synced completely different than the Japanese stereo track. I did not realize it at the time, but for whatever reason, the stereo track was completely re-recorded from scratch for El Hazard. So normally, like a stereo track and a 5.1 track on an older show like this, they would try to probably simulate it in some way so that your rear channels and your subwoofer and your center channels and everything are somewhat, they're not exact 5.1s. It's not like they're recording in these different directions, but they're arranging them in a way to simulate a 5.1 track. But for this show, they actually went back in and re-recorded the whole show from scratch. They got all the actors to come back in and reprise their roles and redo their parts and redo all their lines and recordings from scratch. And that results in things being kind of a little strange. And a lot of people who had the original Pioneer DVD sets or the Genion DVD set, they would have noticed things like, hey, my subtitle track doesn't perfectly align depending on what language I watch it in. If I watch it in stereo versus 5.1 Japanese, my subtitles may be early, or they may be late, or they may drift. And like one of the examples I was going to showcase here, there's a big segment here of narration where he's talking about the world, and you can hear the drift between the two different versions. It's pretty significant, actually. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set it so that the Japanese stereo is playing, but I also have the 5.1 track enabled as well, so you can hear both of them layered over the top of each other. The idea being that you can hear his voice twice. You'll hear two different recordings of his voice, but they'll be coming in at different times. So this is an example of that.
El Hazardの大地を担す神の水脈生体派その彼方に彼らバグロの大帝国がある。そこは唯一絶対の女王ディーバの支配する神秘の世界なのだ。全ては伝説に包まれた謎の彼方。かつてバグロムの地に足を踏み入れた者は誰もいない。
So it gets pretty significantly off in places. Going through this, I've even found places where that they've added in a little bit of audio back when they re-recorded the 5.1. They might have had a character say something just a little bit differently. They'll use a different amount of expression in recording their line. They might be like exclamatory in one line and subdued in another. I found differences in the next episode previews with like some of the wording is completely different. So I mean, things have really varied between these two different recordings, and I wasn't sure how many people know that unless they're really, really well familiar with the show. But one of the things that we're doing, of course, is that we're making 2 sets of reference files for the show, so that we have the one video reference that references the Japanese stereo track, and as we go through, we're subtitling to that stereo track and making sure that everything matches and that the translation is cleaned up and is appropriate and reflective of that Japanese stereo track. And then we have an entirely different video reference file for the 5.1 track, where we're going through that and subtitling specifically to that track and making sure that all of the Japanese and everything is reflective of that translation as well. I don't think I've ever had to actually do that twice before. That's definitely not typical. One of the things that we have had to do before in terms of retiming subtitles is a lot of our earlier releases that we did on DVD. When we released the Blu-ray version, oftentimes we'll get a new video source, or we'll get, the video source that we'll get will be in a different time frame. So instead of getting video that is 29.97 frames per second, we'll get video that is 23.98 frames per second. And we'll have to go back in and resubtitle the video with that new time code and that new time rate in mind, which involves making some adjustments to the subtitle files. But usually that's not a super tedious process. It doesn't mean that we have to go back and time every individual subtitle, but it does mean that there's a lot of cleanup. But in this case, since there is no reliable way to know whether or not a line is going to come early or a line is going to come late, or whether the character is going to say one thing or say something completely different, or whether they're going to shout or scream their line and you're going to have an exclamation point, or whether they're just going to kind of say it and trail off, we have to kind of go through each and every single line again and resubtitle the whole thing from scratch, which is something that can be tedious, and depending on whether you account for the time to do that, it can be kind of a surprise and make you go, ugh. But at least in this case, it's something that we caught really, really early on, and we're able to account for it, and we're making sure that as we go through that all of these subs are reflective of whatever track, whatever audio track that you're watching it in. Typically when we do this like a show, Easter eggs are not very common, especially like nowadays nobody does Easter eggs, which, you know, some people find to be like kind of a sad thing. It's like, oh, I miss DVD Easter eggs and things like that. But this show, funny enough, when Pioneer Genion had released the show originally, it did have a lot of Easter eggs. It had, I can't tell you the exact number, I want to say maybe around 13, but they're all English Easter eggs with the English voice cast. And so if you go to one menu on the disc, and then you were to hit down and then left and then hit the enter button, it would take you to a video that would play, or it would play an audio clip over that menu of an English voice actor or some bit that they were doing or talking about something, and it would play it and it would say, this is Easter egg 1 of blah blah blah, see if you can find the rest, or something like that, basically.
The holy lamps of Mount Muldoon are ancient artifacts that are inherited by the high priestess of each element. These lamps help aid each priestess's powers over the elements in this world. With these lamps, we, the priestesses of Mount Muldoon, are sworn to protect the land from destruction. There are yet many secrets to be discovered in the world of El Hazard and in this collection. This is secret number 8. With enough perseverance, all secrets will be unraveled.
I don't know how I stumbled onto them, but when I found out about them, I was like, oh God, you know, we gotta try and find some way to preserve these, you know, gotta do something with them. And so, like, my first thought was, like, it would be really funny and hilarious to try and hide these Easter eggs on a Blu-ray menu in the same way that we would do it on a DVD menu, where you go to a certain particular menu in the scene access, and then you make it so that they have to do a button combination on the remote to access it. But then I thought, you know, these things have been hidden for a long time. I mean, there's a lot of people who probably didn't know about these things to begin with. Let's just take them, put them all together, assemble them into some kind of a video, and, you know, just throw it on the disc as an extra. So that's one of the things that we're doing for the El Hazard release that we're working on. I started in 2003, so I've been here for 17 years. And back before I came to write stuff, I was a big fan of El Hazard, The Wanderers. And so when we picked it up, I was very, very happy and excited. But the OVA series was something I'd only seen, you know, once before and I'd never owned a copy because it was very expensive to buy, and me of limited means, you pick and choose your battles when you're collecting and buying things. But one of the things that really, really struck me about the show when we were going back to work on it was just how gorgeous the visuals are for this show. A lot of modern animation, a lot of it's done digitally. It's not cell painted anymore. It's not traditional animation. And so I feel like you're missing out on a lot of the types of things that a show like this has. And one of the things that really struck me was these backgrounds that they had done for the show. One of the things that they had done was do these incredibly richly detailed backgrounds with just a tremendous amount of detail in them. And as you go through the frame, all of the animation in the segments are just very, very well detailed in terms of just the amount of attention. Even tiny things on screen, they've gone to the extent of trying to draw and put in really, really fine details into the tiny elements. I feel like this first episode in particular showcases a lot of this type of visual. Everything from the painted leaves in the backgrounds to the doors as they're walking down the corridors in the Palace of Rashtaria. All of the backgrounds and everything are just amazing. The scenery, when they first arrive in El-Hazard, they draw a lot of attention to just these rich, gorgeous, lush wilderness and forest and backgrounds. And it's just really striking. It's one of those things that I don't often see in animation, especially nowadays. And seeing this much attention to detail go into just something that's in the background, that's not supposed to be the focus of the shot. Most people watching this, they're looking at the characters and looking at what they're talking about. And the background scenery is just something to add flavor to the world. Well, they put so much attention and focus on the background scenery to try and add flavor to the world. And I feel like they did a really, really good job. One of the things that I've seen a couple people in the anime community do is they like to take these pan shots where you have a panoramic shot in an animation, and they've assembled all of these different parts of the panoramic just by slice and assembled this really, really long picture that's either really wide or really tall that shows the full scale of the panoramic. And I've assembled some of these panoramics for El-Hazard. There's just an incredible amount of detail that you can see, like the Bugram Hive, all of the line work and everything, just from the ground all the way on up. You have scenes like Jinai and his Bugram friend overlooking the city after it's been ruined with the Eye of God, and the Eye of God looming over in the skyline. A part of the inside of the Palace of Rashtaria near a fountain where Makoto is sitting on the couch. And this is again one of those examples of one of the things I was talking about where I find the amount of detail that they put into the scene just incredible. If you zoom way into the shot, you can see that even Makoto, who is very, very, very tiny on screen, they went into the level of including just an incredible amount of detail in his posture, the clothing, his expression, the way that he's sitting. It's just really, really amazing. I haven't seen anything like this in any time recently. Here's another shot of the indoor part of the Palace of Rashtaria as they're walking through the corridors. And obviously the only animated element in this shot are just the characters here and the tiny part of the back here. And they move slowly toward the screen, but the focus of the shot is just the gorgeous visual imagery of the inside of the palace. So I mean, when they're talking about the show being, the magnificent world of El-Hazard, they really want you to focus on that magnificent world aspect of it. Like, sure, the characters are a very central focus of the show, but they really, really put an incredible, painstaking amount of detail into trying to make everything just as beautiful and amazing as you possibly could. It's about stages for sure. So when you're starting in early stages, you're working on things that are, like I said, if you're doing subtitling, it might be something that's a relatively tedious process of going in and painstakingly putting in the in time and out time of every piece of dialogue in the show. But as you get through each step in the process, you just get that much closer and closer to having something that is a finished disc or a finished product that people can take a look at and see. So after you've gotten the subtitles done, you move on to the next step of, putting these and, making sure that you've output your video and your audio and making rough checks so that you have something to look at and see, hey, do my subtitles match up with everything on screen okay with the final video? Is my English aligned and matching up with the characters and everything sounds and seems to work okay? Do I have any weird anomalies that appeared in my video, or is there any degradation in the video if it's an older video? And as you kind of get through each step in the process, you get closer and closer to that final disc where everything is assembled, and you've got your menus and you've got your extras and you've got everything. And it's just kind of interesting to see that go from step one where there's nothing assembled to that final step where everything is just collected together in a nice, neat form. It's not that in any particular stage of the process either that you don't end up having to go back in and everything. There are many times where we'll get to later stages and it's like, oh God, I gotta go back and I gotta take a look and I gotta change some things in the subtitles. I found that there's some stuff that's missing, or there's some dialogue that there's a typo or something of that nature, and you have to go back and change that and edit and fix it and put that back in. But it's just kind of like you're making this steady progress toward this final thing, and along the way it's great because you're seeing it take shape, because like especially early on when you're doing the subtitling, you're just working off of video reference files. But when you get to the final product, you're looking at it, you know, in its full glorious, you know, appearance. You're watching it on a TV, you're watching it in front of a stereo system, so you're getting all the benefits of having a great picture, great sound. You get to basically finally enjoy this thing that you've been working on so hard in the same way that anybody else who buys the show will get to enjoy it. This show is just, it's wonderful. It really is. You know, it's funny, it's interesting, and then it's just a treat to look at it. It's just beautiful.